Good afternoon. My name is Tyler Keats, and I'm a loan officer with FCS Financial here in Springfield, Missouri. It is my pleasure to introduce today's keynote speaker, Dr. Peter Ballerstedt. Peter Ballerstedt received his Bachelor of Science in Agriculture in 1981 and Master of Science in 1983, both from the University of Georgia. He received his PhD from the University of Kentucky in 1986, specializing in forage management and utilization, minoring in ruminant nutrition. He was the forage extension specialist at Oregon State University from 1986 to 1992. Peter has extensive experience in forage agriculture. He was the forage extension specialist at Oregon State University from 1986 until 1992. He was Barenberg USA's forage product manager from 2011 until 2018 and is currently their forage ambassador. His study of human nutrition is fueled by his personal experience. What he's learned doesn't agree with the dietary advice we've been given for more than 50 years. This understanding, combined with his forage background, has strengthened his interest in the truly sustainable agriculture, the production of ruminant animal products. Peter has spoken at many different events in the US and internationally. Many of his presentations are available on YouTube. Peter and Nancy live in Western Oregon with their two dogs, Connor and Noni. Please welcome Dr. Peter Ballerstedt.
Thank you. Good afternoon. If during the course of this presentation you have any questions, please submit them and we will try to address them as time permits. My name is Peter Ballerstedt. I work for Barenberg USA as their forage ambassador. The topic for this presentation is red meat and our health, separating scientific fact from politics, emotion, and misinformation. And yeah, I'm going to try to do all that in one talk. No, really. Hopefully what we can do is just start the process and maybe give us some food for thought. You should pardon the expression. Before I get started, it's only fair to tell you that obviously the opinions that I'm going to express are based on my understanding of the relevant published scientific literature. They're not necessarily the opinions of my employers, but I'm working on them. It's also important for people to understand that I'm not a medical doctor, so nothing I say in this presentation should be taken as medical advice. I'm more than happy to introduce people to the sources, to the references, and to health practitioners. My goal is to help each of us become better informed so that we can be active participants with our healthcare team. As disclosure, tell you who I am. I've worked in forage agriculture for most of my adult life. Obviously, I presently work for a seed company, Barenberg USA, and I'm an advocate for therapeutic carbohydrate reduction and ruminant animal agriculture. I've gotten to do that internationally to a variety of audiences. But it's always a pleasure when I get back home into my forage conferences where I don't have to explain that there is no taste test in a hay judging contest. So misinformation, emotions, politics, I think the key to addressing all of those and helping people to sort it out is to understand what the scientific facts are. And I want to focus today on what is the evidence of harm from too little. Is there such a thing as too little animal source food in general, red meat in particular, in human diets? And then similarly, what is the evidence of harm from too much? So let's just review a few things, shall we? Eating red meat will not make you fat, clog your arteries, give you diabetes, cause cancer, kill your kidneys, acidify your blood, or melt your bones. Nor will it make you morally weak, and it won't deprive you of food or anyone else, drive climate change, or destroy the planet. Yet all of those and many others that I'm sure we could come up with are part of this narrative, this argument against consuming animal source foods and animal source food production. And for too many people, those arguments appear really strong, they look like a nice thick rope. But I want to suggest that if we can test each strand of that big rope, each one of those strands has been shown to be weak and is based on flawed beliefs. And if we could get better at telling our story, I think we could help more people understand this. Currently, there's a lot of people who are on their own health journey, and we refer to those as N=1 experiments. There's no degrees of freedom when there's N=1. It's not research, but it's my experience. And as one person said, if you have the choice between your experience and a hypothesis, go with your experience. Mine could be called a Christmas story. So in 2007 at Christmas time, took the family picture by setting up the camera with on a tripod with the timer. And when I looked at the picture, so I was a 51-year-old balding, obese, pre-diabetic. Note the Hawaiian shirt, which is great camouflage. 3 years later, as a result of following some advice that I got from sources that I will share during this presentation, I was no longer anything but balding. And my case is not unique. There's a growing number of people who can relate this sort of personal story. And today I still maintain that weight loss. And today I am still not pre-diabetic. And I'm not on medication for that condition. About that time, 2010, I started attending conferences where physicians, researchers, clinicians of various kinds were attending and speaking about therapeutic carbohydrate reduction. If you're familiar with any of the people within this space, you might well recognize some of the people in this picture. But remarkably enough, I was the only forage agronomist that would show up at these things. I don't understand it. So I got asked the question, what's a forage agronomist? And once I explained that, the second question was, what are you doing here? Let alone when I started speaking at these events. And what this taught me is there is this gulf between producers and consumers. And there's far more consumers than there are producers. But if we can find a way to build bridges, what we'll realize is that we care about the same things. We may understand them differently because of our experience, but if we can have relationships, learn how to listen to each other and learn from each other, I think we can go a long way towards eliminating a lot of the misinformation, the emotions, and frankly, it will help us in the political conversations because it will build allies. And one of the ways you can do that is with a bit of humor. So you want to be a vegan like us, huh? Sorry, kid, you need more guts. People don't understand the essential role that ruminant animal agriculture plays in our food systems because they don't understand the essential difference between ruminants and monogastrics. They don't understand the fundamentals of forage management and all these related topics that we so often take for granted. But I want to encourage us to learn how to tell those stories because people are interested, and I think they're really good stories. We have to learn how to tell them better. And here's another of my attempts to say that true health food comes from ruminants. These are all different fermented plant products. Once we've explained what ruminant nutrition and digestion's all about, then maybe they'll get the joke. Or maybe it's just not that funny and I only think it is. But then we can take them maybe a little further and understand that when we go to a more global perspective, things look very different in the low and middle income countries than they do in the high income countries. And this too, I think, will help us if we can explain this to our consumers. The quote from this paper published in 2019, the notion that raising livestock and consuming animal source food is fundamentally incompatible with sustainable development is flawed. I think that's a very kind adjective, but it's a quote from the paper. The title is Animal Source Food, Sustainability Problem or Malnutrition and Sustainability Solution. Perspective matters. And again, I think that perspective has been lacking in the voices that are heard by many in the consumer population. So Dr. Ballerstedt says, we have no hope of feeding today's world, let alone the world of 2050, without ruminant animal agriculture as a fundamental part of whatever agricultural systems are practiced in whatever part of the world they're being practiced. I understand that this is a little different than we commonly hear, but it's completely defensible. Part of the problem is that human nutrition and medicine cannot obtain the answers that animal nutrition and veterinary medicine can. They don't have the same tools, there are ethical constraints, and until we really understand that, we can't really appreciate just how poorly we've been served by human nutrition and human medicine in the area of nutritional epidemiology of chronic disease. So this nutritional epidemiology has actually been referred to as mythology. They're building a story that says, we know that if you eat this way, you lower your risk of contracting a variety of chronic diseases 20, 30, 40 years from now. They don't, we can't. We just need to be honest about that. The reasons for this are that the methodology of nutritional epidemiology of chronic disease are based on questionnaire-based guesses. We're going to identify populations of people, free-living human beings, because we can't control them. We can't house them in a laboratory. And then we're going to ask them periodically to try to recall how much of various foods that they ate. We're going to force them to guess because we won't accept no or no answer. We're going to constrain the answers that they can give, and then we're going to try to form some statistical inference based on that information and what diseases they contract over the course of their lifetime or the study. Again, if nothing's measured, there's no real data. We're pretty familiar with this. It's hard for us to realize just how bad this has been. One indication might be that at least 80% of the findings of this kind of study fail in clinical trials. Now, you would think that if it was entirely up to chance, it would be 50-50, like flipping a coin. The fact that it's so much worse than raw chance indicates that there's a bias at play. Now, a lot of this is understood within the scientific communities involved, but it never reaches the public. There's also significant conflict of interest at work. I mean no disrespect to people of faith, but this was a paper that was published by a Seventh-day Adventist member who also happens to be one of the people on the Dietary Guidelines Advisory Committee. They see this as one of their faith roles, and if you don't understand the significance, Seventh-day Adventists advocate a plant-only diet. Again, I have no argument with people's individual choices, but when those become voices influencing public policy, I think we need to be aware of them, and I think we need to weigh their advice accordingly. When we get to politics, of course, there's a lot of things that we could talk about. My talk tomorrow will focus more on environmental issues than I will deal with today. But dietary policy has influenced this conversation as well. One of my messages is that there are a lot of people, both in our country and abroad, who desperately need a proper or at least higher quality diet. And one of our primary needs is, as this quote says, to go out and love to others. The only way to be loved is to be loving. Maybe we could transcend some of what's going on today if we could just try to treat us all. There's no us and them. It's all us, and there are needs that need to be met, and we have some of the answers. And I think, again, there are ways for us to become more effective at crossing these barriers or the gulfs between what I refer to as tribes. So I'll ask individuals in this audience, are you part of the 12 or part of the 88? The quote from this 2019 paper, the prevalence of metabolic health in American adults is alarmingly low, even in normal weight individuals. Less than 88% are metabolically healthy. So, where do you think you fall? Yeah, I know. I'm going from preaching to meddling now, but I'll come back to this because I think we have the best message going, which is that we can have healthy people and healthy soils thanks to ruminant animal agriculture. One of the ways to get better at telling our story is to have a personal health journey of our own. And there's some other things I just like to let people become aware of. Within that circle, more of humanity resides within that circle than in the rest of the world. There's a lot of water in that circle. We have a lot of land. We can produce these animal source foods as well as in other parts of the world. I don't mean to suggest that we need to think about feeding everyone. There's lots of room for improvement in the rest of the grassland agriculture world. But clearly, we're going to be talking about shipping food from some place of production to the places of consumption when you think about where humanity resides. It's also important for us to think about what malnutrition actually looks like. And in this, we have to confront some sort of conventional wisdom. So conventionally, and certainly when I grew up, we were thinking about those that this source describes as undernourished. That is, they have a caloric intake below their requirements. And currently, about 11% of the world's population falls into that category. So a little over 800 million people are undernourished by that definition. Over a fifth of children younger than 5 are stunted, which is in part due to caloric intake, but mostly it's due to a lack of essential nutrition. 9% of the world's population are severely food insecure. 1 in 4 people globally, 1.9 billion, are moderately to severely food insecure. But overweight and obesity are in fact a form of malnutrition. Conventionally, we haven't looked at it that way, but a more informed perspective suggests that it ought to be part of that as well. Worldwide, obesity has nearly tripled since 1975. By 2016, almost 2 billion adults 18 and older were overweight, and of those, 650 million being obese. So let's add those up. What that means is close to 3 billion human beings out of 7.5 in the current population are malnourished. Most of the world's population now live in countries where overweight and obesity kill more people than being underweight. Let me just draw your attention to this little graphic over here. What's in his right hand? Oh, that's a hamburger. So what's the implication? That eating beef in a hamburger is somehow the cause of obesity. Right? People don't think about the bun. They don't think about the half gallon of carbonated sugar water. They don't think about the potatoes fried in industrial seed oil. No, no, no. It's got to be the beef patty. Maybe that's not right. 38 million children under the age of 5 were overweight or obese in 2019. So we have this global epidemic of condition of malnutrition. What isn't well understood is that this manifests in a variety of chronic diseases, which themselves are a far bigger killer than infectious diseases. And if we're going to meet our sustainable development goals, we have to address malnutrition, but we have to do it from a fully informed understanding. So the first question when it comes to the consumption of animal source food, is there such a thing as too little animal source food in human diet? Well, clearly, yes. We have 2 billion people in the world who are suffering from micronutrient malnutrition. One of the problems that we're going to face going forward is stunted mothers are likely to have stunted children. So now we've got an intergenerational thing going on as well. And these researchers are saying and working to alleviate the fact that this is primarily due to a lack of animal source food in the diets of these people. Another way to look at it, we can look at the rate of stunting, percent of children 0 to 59 months old, against the meat consumption, annual per capita consumption. And we can see a very strong relationship between where in countries where you have the least consumption per capita of meat, in these children you have the highest rate of stunting. And we ought to point out that this is not only in the child's diet, we ought to also be thinking about in the expectant mother and nursing mother's diet. And just for reference, you may have heard of something called Eat Lancet. They came out with a planetary diet. Their level of recommendation would put humanity firmly in the high stunting range. So anyone who talks about how humanity ought to be on a plant-based diet, let's just say that humanity is already on a plant-based diet. The majority of humanity's calories come from plant source foods, and the majority of humanity's protein comes from plant source foods. And this is crude protein. This is not true protein that's of value to human nutrition. So it's worse than these data would suggest. And that's part of the problem as well, even in the so-called developed or high-income countries where we're getting more of our protein from animal source food than plant source food. They're counting these as equivalent. A gram of crude protein from one source being equal to a gram of crude protein from another source. It clearly isn't. Everyone understands this, but we just won't talk about it. In the United States, when we look at where our calories are coming from, it's just under 60% of our calories end up coming from grains, plants, added plant lipids, so the industrial oils, and the added sugar and sweeteners. Only 30% of our calories in the United States come from animal source foods. Maybe that's the problem. I'd like to suggest that it is. And again, we're treating animal as if, and plant source foods as if they're equivalent, and they're not equivalent on any basis that you want to look at them. The energy that comes from animal source foods is going to primarily come from animal fats, and those fats have a very different metabolic effect on humans than the sugar and starches that come from plant source foods. The protein and minerals that come from animal source foods are far more available and far more valuable to humans than the same amount of those same substances, if we can get them at all, from plant source foods. And vitamin requirement actually depends on the source of our diet. So the more plant source foods we eat, the higher our vitamin requirement is. And again, this is known, it's just inconvenient. If we could properly value protein, we would see that the environmental footprint of animal source food production, when evaluated properly, actually comes out to be very similar. And this paper in 2016 stated these considerations might be useful in political planning of the food production system aiming at providing sufficient foods for humans in the near future. Well, here's politics, and the idea of politically planning the food production system is a frightening concept to me. But pay attention, it's happening. There are conversations taking place this year, and we could talk about that in the question and answer phase. Again, malnutrition, in particular, a diet that is low in animal source foods typically results in low intakes of bioavailable iron and zinc, calcium, retinol, which is preformed vitamin A, vitamin B, riboflavin, vitamin B6, and vitamin B12. Kind of sounds like the diet that's being advocated is one that's going to end up with multiple micronutrient deficiencies. Probably protein deficiency as well, or specific amino acid deficiency. So, conclusion from the first question, there is such a thing as too little animal source food in the human diet. Second question, is there really such a thing as too much? Again, this is part of the conversation that we should restrict animal source food consumption for health and nutrition reasons. Where's the evidence? I would suggest that those warnings about animal source food and specifically red meat consumption are unsupportable and improbable. Claims about the health dangers of red meat are not only improbable in the light of our evolutionary history, they are far from being supported by robust scientific evidence. So claims that red meat causes disease, this evidence is weak. It doesn't meet the established causality criteria, even if you're going to use epidemiological data. It's at risk of bias in interpretation and translation. It's contrary to common sense, and it's often dishonest. This last reference is particularly interesting. There's a very prominent activist by the name of Dr. Katz, who, among others, tried to get this article and several others not published. He did some other things that transcend accepted behavior. He said that he compared the articles in the Annals of Internal Medicine. He called them a great debacle of public health, and he compared them to information terrorism that can blow to smithereens the life work of innumerable careful scientists. Well, if you read the references I'll provide, one questions his characterization of these scientists. But the authors of this particular paper said some of the researchers have built their careers on nutritional epidemiology. I can understand it's upsetting when the limitations of your work are uncovered and discussed in the open. But that's what's happening. Well, shouldn't the public know that if we're talking about public policy? So Dr. Ballerstedt says, The preponderance of high-quality evidence from all scientific disciplines strongly suggests that the most likely harm associated with red meat consumption is from not consuming enough. So let's go back to the personal. Has your doctor said that you should eat less or no red meat because you need to lose some weight? Because you've got diabetes or prediabetes or metabolic syndrome? Because your cholesterol's too high? Because your blood pressure's too high? Because you've had cancer? What's the basis of that recommendation? Remember the statistic when I asked, are you part of the 88 or part of the 12? Here's how you can tell. You do not have optimal metabolic health if one of the following is true for you. If you have abdominal obesity, if your serum triglycerides are elevated, if your HDL cholesterol is depressed, if your blood pressure is elevated, if your fasting blood glucose is elevated or your hemoglobin A1C is above 5.7, or if you're taking medications for any of those conditions. The good news is there's well-established lifestyle interventions that can address these conditions. Diet primarily. Again, I'm not that kind of doctor, so I'm not giving medical advice, but one of my references is a group of metabolic health practitioners that can help you learn more and maybe even help you through the process as well. So, resources to help you learn more and maybe become a better advocate for ruminant animal agriculture and red meat in the human diet. The entire issue in October of 2019 of Animal Frontiers dealt with a number of topics related to this title, Foods of Animal Origin, a Prescription for Global Health. It's freely available. You can find it on the web, download it. Dietdoctor.com is a website that I recommend. They are subscription supported. They do not take advertising or industry funding, but there's a lot of information that's available there free. You don't have to subscribe to get a lot of information. Some of the information, and even there's a first month free. I have no commercial ties to them, although some of my presentations are there. There's just been launched this dynamic white paper that deals with the ethical, the health and environmental and ethical issues around animal source food production and consumption. What I mean by a dynamic white paper is it's kept current with the latest research, and it's written in such a way that you could read the paper, but then there's thorough linkage to all the research. So that's another free resource. I just mentioned the Society of Metabolic Health Practitioners. You can find their website. They have a listing of practitioners. They also have a clinical guidelines document, which has just a wealth of information and references included in it as well. No charge to access that information. In terms of books that I recommend, Gary Taubes was the author that I read that launched me into deeper study of the subject of human nutrition and health. The latest book that he's written, The Case for Keto, just came out last December. I would recommend that book. His first book dealing with human nutrition, good calories, bad calories, would make a good graduate level textbook. Not everybody wants to read something like that. I have read it several times. That's the difference between me and a normal person, I guess. And The Case Against Sugar is another good book the general audience would probably enjoy. And it makes the case of how that industry influenced how we got to where we are today in terms of conventional wisdom and dietary guidelines. Nina Teicholz's book, The Big Fat Surprise, Why Butter, Meat, and Cheese Belong in a Healthy Diet, is one that I think anyone in animal agriculture needs to read. A book that came out last year, earlier in the year, Why We Get Sick, tells us about the insulin resistance and hyperinsulinemia epidemic that's taking place today globally, not just in the high-income countries, but this is a global phenomenon. That's a book that I recommend as well. The diet that I followed is the Protein Power Life Plan, which was written by Doctors Michael and Mary Dan Eads. Dr. Eads also has a blog, Protein Power, which I should have listed in the free resources. This was a book that opened my eyes about the status of the world, and so I think it's important for us to understand some of this. Unfortunately, Dr. Rosling passed away prior to publication, but he has a way of showing us how not to be wrong about how we think about the world. And again, that launched me onto a train of thought that introduced me to a man named Robert Bryce, and A Question of Power is his book. He also has a documentary that was released recently called Juice: How Electricity Explains the World. And when you realize that 45% of humanity consumes less than 1,000 kilowatt hours of electricity a year, which is less or about the equivalent of a large American refrigerator, you begin to see some of the issues that need more attention than the ones that get all the press. You can contact me. I'm all over social media. Please feel free to email me at pballerstedt@barusa.com. You can find me, as I say, many places in social media. I have recently launched a podcast, which I call a sodcast, and that's available wherever podcast platform you use. Also video of these interviews on YouTube. Look for Meet Your Herdmates, and you should be able to find that. Finally, I want everyone to be sure to take their daily meds, which stands for meat, eggs, dairy, and seafood. And a steak a day keeps the doctor away. But remember, I'm not that kind of doctor. Thank you. And if you have any questions, look forward to answering them either during the Q&A or, again, if you have any questions, please don't hesitate to contact me.
Appreciate the talk by Peter Ballerstedt here. We'll start off with, how can I learn more about this?
Well, I would like to thank you and the organizers for the opportunity to start this process. There are lots of resources. I tried to list some there. Recommend that the dynamic white paper is an excellent place to start, and would link you into all the current research. It's remarkably current what those organizers are able to do. And then dietdoctor.com, a site that I have no commercial interest in, but I recommend because I know the people and I know the content. And then if you want to buy some books or maybe get them from your local library, those books are ones that I recommend without reservation. There's a lot of other information available. This movement is growing and there's more and more every day. So that means you have to have a little discernment, but still it's evidence of the change. So I just encourage people, happy to correspond with people. So I welcome emails, but please start learning on your own.
Excellent. Thank you. Another really good question. Been very popular lately and a lot of misconception, I believe, about it. And you probably have a rich opinion. What are your thoughts about fake meat products?
I start by saying I have one word for you: margarine. We were told that margarine was a healthier replacement for butter. And in the fullness of time, we recognized that margarine was in fact not a healthier replacement for butter. And plus the fact it doesn't taste nearly as good. So they didn't get that right. Part of the problem is that as long as we treat meat and protein as if they're synonymous terms, and we put meat in the protein category of foods as they do for the dietary guidelines, then that sets the ground for making these kinds of what I think are false equivalencies. So you get far more nutrition from meat than merely protein, as important as protein is. There's lots of essential nutrition that we get from meat as an animal source food that frankly isn't available from plant source food, or is better sourced from animal than plant source foods. We're going to take plant source ingredients, we're going to process them, and we're going to make this replacement product. And we know that plant source foods are more variable in their composition. That's why we test hay all the time. And when we process them, we can dramatically decrease their nutritional value for humans. And none of that is being taken into account when they make these comparisons between the nutritive value of this highly processed plant product and minimally processed meat. So there's a number of other arguments that I can go into, but basically I think that their entire argument is based on a series of false premises.
Excellent. Yeah, that's definitely very controversial. A lot of things to talk about there. I'll go with one more question from producer that we have here. They said, I've heard you several times over the past few years. Do you think that we are making any headway at changing public opinion?
I think that we are. And the reason is because more and more people are having these personal experiences that are shifting what they themselves feel they must practice to be as healthy as they can be. And then that opens up wider conversations about agricultural practices or realities. I'm reminded that a tipping point in society doesn't have to be 51% of the population. It could be something more like 18%. And we see beginnings of market shift and industries or businesses recognizing there's an unserved potential market. And so they find a way to exploit that segment. We don't have to go there. We can just go to the supermarket and buy what's available, so long as we know what we're looking for. I think that more and more we are making progress. I hear from people who tell me stories that start with something that 10 years ago I would have been tensed up and ready to hear the nightmare. And yet they say, and my doctor tells me, which is information very aligned with the information I've presented. So more and more people are aware. It's a growing level of awareness throughout many different disciplines. I just think that if we can find ways to build bridges and communicate more effectively, we'll actually advance that tipping point.
Awesome. Well, it's great to have you on here, Peter. We really appreciate you, appreciate what you're doing for the industry, and hope to hear from you soon.
Tomorrow.
That's right. You're on tomorrow. Thank you.
Thank you.